Morning. Welcome to Bible study for Sunday, January 24th, 2021. My name is Carolyn Hayes. I'm the Director of Children and Young Families at Gaithersburg Presbyterian Church. And welcome to Bible study. Today we are going to start really diving into Chronicles. We're going to cover the first 14 chapters, which in my feeble way of dividing First Chronicles up is about the first third, because frankly, the first 9 chapters are you go through really fast. We're going to pray, and then I'm going to talk for just a second, and then we're going to get started. Okay, here we go. Gracious and loving Lord, thank you for today. Please open our hearts, open our minds, open our ears, and open our eyes to you and to your word. Help us to understand how people who lived so long ago and things that happened so long ago really do have meaning in our lives today. Help us to be able to see you at work in our world each and every day. Help us to see you in all the people that we encounter. And so help us to treat each and every person as though we were meeting Jesus. Help us treat them with kindness, with compassion, with mercy, with respect, with dignity. Help us to be people who work actively for justice and for peace. Please bless this study and us to thy service. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, by way of full disclosure, this is about my 6th time doing this, because what we're going to do is we're going to cover First Chronicles, but First Chronicles goes back and covers a lot of stuff that was already covered in Samuel, but the stories are different. And I'm going to apologize up front for fumbling, because it's hard, and in some cases, Samuel will tell a story in 2 different ways, and sometimes it's just hard to keep them all straight. So I'm going to do the best I can. But the basic thing to remember about Chronicles is the setting. It's all about context. This was written for people, for Hebrew people, the people of God who had been in exile. And remember why they were in exile. They were in exile, well, yeah, because the Babylonians or the Assyrians overrun them and took them into exile, but also because they'd forgotten who they were. They were not acting like the people of God. And so what these 2 books, one of the things that they're trying to do is to remind them who they are, to go back into history and to look at the best of who they were, to encourage people to act like the best that they could be. And consequently, there's some stuff that is kind of glossed over. And when you think about what they were trying to do, it really does make sense. Anyway, so First Chronicles opens up, as we've said, with genealogies. It's just a whole bunch of genealogies. Literally, the very first thing says, okay, well, we're going to get you up to Noah, which they do. And then they start winnowing even from there. They get you up to Noah and Noah's sons, Ham and Shem. From Shem, you get the Semites, the Shemites. 8 generations removed from Shem, you get Abraham. From Abraham, you get Isaac and Jacob and Esau and the 12 tribes of Israel and so on and so forth. And that's pretty much what they do. They just lay it all out. They also then cover the families in in pretty good detail. It's just listed, but you got them all. The families of David. Then they go through a review of the kings of Judah and the other clans of Judah. Eventually, they get through all of those guys. And by the 8th chapter, you pretty much got everybody, at least the leaders of the clans. You may not have everybody, but you got the leaders of the clans. And then in the 8th chapter, you have the genealogy of Saul. The 9th chapter basically says that all the genealogies of Israel are listed in the books of the kings of Israel. And we are reminded that the people of Judah were taken into captivity because they were unfaithful. When they began returning to Jerusalem, which makes sense that that'd be the place they'd go back to, because that was the capital city. It was where the temple was. It was where they all went for feasts and festivals, to the point that they did that. And also, it also makes sense that the first people to come back were those who were the most religious. It was the priests and the Levites and the temple servants and a few of the northern tribes. The next thing is, for some reason, another listing of Saul's genealogy. Don't know why, it's just there. And then in chapter 10, we start getting into the actual story. As so often happened throughout the world and throughout history, with spring came war. And though they don't specifically say that, I think that's kind of what happened with the Philistines and the Israelites, because they were always at war with each other. And this particular war was exceptionally brutal, went on an exceptionally long time. And we enter Saul's piece of this epic battle. We'll just call it a battle. Saul's realizing, A, he's not going to win. B, he is wounded. He is very shortly after the chapter 10 opens, he's wounded, not quite mortally, but he knows it's really bad. And there's no way for him to escape. There's no way for him to win the battle. And he knows that if the Philistines get a hold of him, it won't be so good. So he tries to fall on his sword. He doesn't kill himself, at least not right crack out of the box. He asks his armor bearer for some help, but the armor bearer couldn't or wouldn't do it. And this is where we get a couple of different accounts. In the first account, the armor bearer doesn't do it. Saul eventually does die. Armor bearer is so distraught, or I don't know. He falls on his own sword and dies too. Then you get toward the very, very end of that book and enter an Amalekite who evidently just happened onto the scene to hear him tell the story. He comes upon this scene. Saul is mortally wounded, but not dead yet, and he really would like to be dead before the Philistines get to him. He asks the Amalekite to run him through, and the Amalekite obliges him. The Amalekite then takes Saul's crown and his armband, which he takes to David. More on this in a minute. In the First Chronicles story, it's much more streamlined. Saul falls into sword and dies. Boom. Okay, back to the Amalekite. Whatever happened there with Saul and swords and so on and so forth, evidently this guy did have Saul's crown and his armband, which he took to David. Apparently apparently thinking he was going to get a reward. David's a real stickler for that kind of thing, and he not only does not reward him, he kills him, because according to the Amalekite, he killed the anointed king. God anointed him the king, and you just don't go around killing people like that, which is why David hadn't done it. In Samuel, following this, there is at least a 2-year period. It may go on a little longer, but it's at least a 2-year period of infighting. David is proclaimed the king of Judah, but apparently not all of Judah, because Saul had one son left. One son, because most of his sons, Jonathan and somebody else, were killed with him in that epic battle. But Ishbosheth apparently was not killed. Saul's main commander, Abner, proclaims Ishbosheth the king of Gilead, Ashuri, Jezreel, and over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all of Israel. And David and Ishbosheth and their men start a series of skirmishes over the next several years. One day, Abner and Joab, David's main military commander, find themselves at the same watering hole. And they say to each other, well, let's have our men fight. And I don't know that it actually says it, but I get the impression that, and I don't think they actually believed it. I think they just wanted to see people fight. But, oh, let's just have done with it. We'll have our guys do it. And then whoever wins, they're the victor. And, so on and so forth. So they fight. David's guys beat Ishbosheth's guys. And for reasons I totally do not understand. Abner runs away. Literally, runs away. Joab sends one of his brothers, who's very fleet of foot, after Abner. Abner tries to get the brother to stop chasing him. The brother says, The brother catches up to Abner, and Abner runs him through, thoroughly enraging Joab. Leave that there. Except to say that David, in the same way that he has very strong feelings about how all of the political stuff, he is very politically correct still at this point. And killing Abner so time goes along. Sorry, forgot something. Time goes along. Joab catches up, kills Abner. Shortly thereafter, Ishbosheth is killed, maybe because his main military commander was dispatched. Ishbosheth is killed, and David condenses all of his power. He assumes the rest of the kingship of Judah. But in doing so, he distances himself from Joab. He makes a really big point, or Samuel makes a really big point, that he distanced himself from Joab. He did not approve of Joab's killing Abner. So in First Chronicles, there is really a very seamless transition. Saul dies, David becomes the king of Judah, and it's just pretty much left there. David becomes the king of Judah. Shortly thereafter, he becomes the king of all of Israel because the Israelites come and say to him, "We want you to be our king." As I just said, it was a more lengthy transition because there was that pesky other son. But David first became the king of part of Judah, and then he became the king of consolidated. He consolidated his power and became the king of all of Judah. And shortly thereafter, in both cases, First Chronicles and Samuel, the Israelites come to David and say, "You are our kith and kin. We want you to be our king." In fact, in First Chronicles, they take literally verbatim, just lift the verse out of Samuel and put it in there. Okay, so David is now the king of all of Israel. The first thing he does in both accounts is to take possession of Jerusalem. In both accounts, the people who are living there, the Jebusites, pretty much say, "We're not giving up without a fight." In 2 Samuel, the fight is a little bit more protracted. There's just more detail. But in both cases, without a whole lot of fanfare and a great deal of battle, David assumes possession. The Israelites take possession of Jerusalem. In Samuel, the next thing that happens is that David goes back to collect the ark. Remember, a long time ago, the ark was taken by the Canaanites, and they held on to it for a while until terrible things started happening to them, and they assumed it was because God was cursing them, because they had it. They had the ark, which has the essence of God in it. And they eventually gave it back. And it has been living for all this time in Abinadab's house. And he's just been keeping it safe. So David, who is, for all of his faults, he's a deeply religious guy. He believes firmly that what the Israelites needed to do was to get into Jerusalem to build a temple, not just the tabernacle, the thing that went with them, but a whole temple. Build a temple there in Jerusalem that was appropriate to God, that would be befitting. And the first thing they needed to do was to get the ark. In Chronicles, before we do that, there are three very odd chapters to my mind. The first is called, it's just a listing of David's mighty men, which to me sounds an awful lot like the Knights of the Round Table. And it literally is just, it's a whole long list of the heads of clans that are his mighty men, his knights, his people who have sworn their allegiance to David, and he's the greatest, and what he says we're going to do, and so on and so forth. There's the next chapter is a summation of the people the men that were with him in Ziklag. And then the last one is kind of I'm going to call it a summation for lack of a better word, of the people who swore allegiance to him in other places like Hebron when he went to Judah after the war. He went to Judah, which is where he was proclaimed king of Judah, because God told him to. All in all, I did not actually do the math, but I did a couple of very quick calculations, and then it was a lot of people. It was probably north of 250,000 leaders, not all of the other guys, the leaders. It's a lot of people. Israel is firmly behind David. So then we get back to David bringing the ark back to, bringing the ark to Jerusalem. Interestingly, in Samuel this time, that story is much shorter than it is in Chronicles. Chronicles goes into great detail talking about the consensus that David tries to build for doing this. This is what we're going to do, and we're all going to go. We're all going to go. We're all going to get the ark, and we're all going to bring it back to Jerusalem where it belongs. Much shorter in Samuel. So there they are. They're on their way to Abinadab's house to get the ark. Unfortunately, nobody remembered the proper way to carry the ark. 5 points to the house that can remember the proper way to carry the ark. For those of you who said, oh, I remember, you put the special poles that are specially made through the little loop things that are on the bottom of the ark, and the specific branch of the Levites that are the ark carriers then carry the ark on their shoulders. Correct. Sadly, David did not remember that. It's been years and years and years and years and years and years and years since they properly followed a lot of stuff. But anyway, so they tried. They put it in a cart, and 2 of Abinadab's sons went with them to keep it safe. Unfortunately, somewhere along the line, near Obed-Edom's house, the ark must have started to wobble, or it looked like it was unsteady. Abinadab's son Uzzah put his hand out to steady it and was immediately smote by the hand of God. Another 5 points if you remember why. The answer to that is you don't touch the ark, hence the poles. But understandably, I think this really freaked David out, and he was afraid. He was genuinely afraid to bring the ark to Jerusalem. So they left it at the home of Obed-Edom the Gittite, where it stayed happily for 3 months, warmly blessing that household, which made it a lot easier for David then about 3 months later to go back and get it, because he saw you just have to do it right. It's not, you just have to do it right. You have to be respectful. You have to follow the rules. And that's where we're going to pick this up next week. Again, I encourage you, if you have not read Samuel, it makes for good reading. It really does. It's very action-packed. And it's interesting to compare it to Chronicles. And then it's interesting to think about why Ezra or Nehemiah or some combination thereof, plus a couple of other people, why they are writing this exactly the way they are doing it. As I said when we started, it makes sense. If you are trying to remind a people of who they are, if you are trying to hold David up as our best and our brightest, and our most faithful, not just best and brightest, but most faithful. You focus on some events and less so on others. Anyway, they are creating an archetype, and that's the way to think about it. They are creating an archetype, an example of the perfect Hebrew king who was deeply faithful, disciplined, merciful, just, and compassionate. And as many societies do, they, or did, we don't have a whole lot of kings left, but they look to their king or queen as their, this is who we're supposed to emulate. We're supposed to be like them. And that's probably to a substantial degree the other part that they're doing. They're not just saying to future kings, this is what you got to measure up to. You've got to be as great as David. But they're also saying to the Hebrew people, this is who we are. We forgot. And this is what we need to get back to doing. It's been more or less 400 years where they have not been they've not been following, or the majority of them. There have always been pockets of people who were very, very, very faithful, but there have also been generation after generation after generation who's genuinely forgotten who they are. They don't follow the ways of the Lord. That's how they find themselves where they are. Anyway, that's where we're going to leave it for today. We will pick this up with David getting that ark back into Jerusalem next week. I hope that you had a great week. I hope you have a great week coming up. I hope you and your families are well and staying safe. I hope that you're taking very good care of each other. Wear your masks, stay in your bubbles, because the end can be in sight. We could be back together here before too much longer, as long as we all do what we're supposed to do now. So be well. Take care.